There is a structure in Egypt that mainstream archaeology cannot date, not because the evidence is missing, but because the evidence points to a date that the standard model of ancient history is not prepared to accept. It sits behind the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, one of the most sacred sites in ancient Egypt, a city that served as a religious center for over 3,000 years. The temple above ground is magnificent, its walls covered in some of the finest relief carvings in the ancient world, its colors still visible after 3,000 years, its architecture a testament to the skill and ambition of the New Kingdom pharaohs. But behind the temple, partially buried, partially flooded, sitting in a pit that has to be descended into rather than entered at ground level, there is something else. Something that doesn't match the temple. Something that doesn't match anything in the New Kingdom period. Something that does not match anything in the Old Kingdom period either. It is called the Osireion. And the closer you look at it, the harder it becomes to explain when it was built, who built it, and why it looks so completely different from everything that surrounds it. The Osireion is, in the assessment of researchers who have studied it carefully, one of the most anomalous structures in Egypt, which means it is one of the most anomalous structures on Earth. The Osireion was rediscovered in 1902 by Egyptologists Margaret Murray and Flinders Petrie, the same Petrie who measured the granite box in the king's chamber and found tolerances he could not explain. What they found when they excavated the structure was immediately puzzling. The Osireion sits significantly below the level of the Seti I temple behind which it was buried. To reach it, you descend into a pit, into the earth, into a structure that sits at a depth inconsistent with the New Kingdom construction above it. The depth alone suggested great age. Structures that are older tend to be buried deeper, as centuries of accumulated sand and debris raise the surrounding ground level. The structure itself is built from enormous blocks of red Aswan granite and brown quartzite sandstone. The granite blocks are among the largest used in any Egyptian construction, some of them weighing over 100 tons. Comparable to the heaviest stones in the Serapeum. They are placed without mortar, fitted together with a precision that requires no binding material because the stones themselves are cut to fit so exactly that the joint between them is essentially seamless. The walls are undecorated, no hieroglyphs, no relief carvings, no paintings, no inscriptions of any kind on the primary structure. This is extraordinary. Egyptian builders covered their walls with text and image. From the earliest dynasties onward, the interior surfaces of sacred structures were decorated, with the names of the builders, with religious texts, with scenes from mythology and royal life. The decoration was not aesthetic, it was theological. The images and words on the walls were active elements of the religious function of the space. A sacred structure with bare walls is not simply unusual in ancient Egypt, it is almost without precedent. And yet the Osireion's primary stonework is bare, completely. Not damaged bare, not stripped bare, but originally bare, built without decoration from the beginning. This is the first anomaly. The second is the date. The conventional dating of the Osireion places it in the reign of Seti I, around 1280 BC. This dating is based primarily on the fact that some inscriptions and decorations were added to the structure during the New Kingdom period, texts painted or carved onto the walls, in a style consistent with Seti I's reign, and a reference to Seti I in some of the later additions to the complex. But Seti I did not necessarily build what he decorated. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in ancient Egypt. Later, pharaohs added their names and their inscriptions to structures that already existed, claiming the monuments as their own, or simply adding to them as part of ongoing religious maintenance. The practice was so common that archaeologists have a term for it: usurpation. And it is one of the primary reasons that attributing a structure to the pharaoh whose name appears in it is considered methodologically unreliable. The Osireion's core structure, the massive granite and quartzite megaliths, the undecorated walls, the architectural design, shows no stylistic connection to the New Kingdom period. New Kingdom Egyptian architecture has a recognizable vocabulary: slender columns, elaborate surface decoration, proportions that reflect the aesthetic preferences of the period. The Osireion has none of this. What it has instead is a style of construction that Egyptologists have described, carefully and with evident discomfort, as megalithic. Large, unworked or minimally worked blocks of hard stone, placed with precision, without decoration, in configurations that prioritize structural mass over architectural elegance. This style of construction appears at Giza, at the Sphinx Temple, at the Valley Temple adjacent to the Sphinx. It does not appear elsewhere in the New Kingdom. It doesn't appear in the Old Kingdom either, except at those specific sites at Giza. The sites that Robert Schoch's geological evidence suggests were built before the Old Kingdom, before the flood, before the civilization whose records we have. The Osireion is not simply architecturally anomalous. Its design encodes something. At the center of the structure is a raised rectangular platform surrounded by a channel of water, a moat, effectively, that isolates the central platform from the surrounding structure. The platform is accessible only by 2 staircases that descend from the surrounding gallery. The symbolism is explicit and ancient. The raised island surrounded by water is one of the most fundamental images in Egyptian cosmology. The primordial mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. In Egyptian myth, this was where the first act of creation occurred, where consciousness first separated itself from the undifferentiated water that preceded existence. The Osireion was built to embody this image physically, to make the creation myth architecturally present, to place whoever entered the structure inside the moment of creation itself. But this image, the primordial mound, the island in the waters of chaos, is not specifically a New Kingdom image. It is not specifically an Old Kingdom image. It is one of the oldest images in Egyptian religious thought, predating the dynasties, predating the hieroglyphic record, reaching back to a period before history that Egyptian tradition itself acknowledged but could not fully document. The Osireion was built to house this image, not the image of a specific pharaoh's power, not the narrative of a specific dynasty's theology. The oldest image, the deepest image, the image that Egyptian religion placed at the beginning of everything, which raises a question that the conventional dating cannot comfortably answer. Why would Seti I, in the 13th century BC, build a structure of this architectural type, massive, undecorated, megalithic, to embody an image this ancient, in a style that appears at no other New Kingdom site? unless he didn't build it, unless he found it. The connection to Osiris is not incidental. Abydos was, throughout ancient Egyptian history, the most sacred site associated with the cult of Osiris, the god of death, resurrection, and the underworld. It was believed to be the location of Osiris's tomb. Pilgrimages to Abydos were made by Egyptians of every period, from the earliest dynasties to the Roman era, to connect with the power of Osiris and to seek his blessing for their own passage through death. The Osireion was specifically associated with Osiris's resurrection. It was, according to the religious texts added to it during the New Kingdom, the place where Osiris's body lay after his death, the point of transition between death and rebirth, between the dissolution of form and its reconstitution. The water surrounding the central platform was not incidental to this symbolism. Osiris's resurrection was associated with the annual flooding of the Nile, the moment when the water receded and the black, fertile soil appeared, embodying the emergence of new life from apparent death. The Osireion was built to be the physical location of this mystery, a place where the cycle of death and resurrection was not simply described or depicted, but enacted, made real in stone and water and the darkness of a structure buried below the surface of the living world. Now bring back the thread that this series has been following since the third video, the Hall of Records, the underground complex beneath the Sphinx, the sealed chambers of the Temple Mount, the Serapeum's tunnels beneath Saqqara. In every case, the significant structures are below ground, underground, descended into rather than ascended to, associated with what is hidden, what is preserved, what waits beneath the surface for the moment of revelation. And in every case, in the Serapeum, in the tunnels beneath Giza, in the passages beneath Jerusalem, the name that appears is Osiris, the god of what is buried, the god of what waits, the god whose resurrection is the central act of the most important mystery in ancient Egyptian religion. The Osireion is not simply an anomalous structure with an uncertain date. It is the point where all the threads of this series converge. The underground structure, the megalithic granite, the water, the primordial mound, the death and the resurrection. Osiris, again, always. In 1914, the archaeologist Henri Frankfurt conducted a more systematic excavation of the Osireion than Murray and Petrie had been able to complete. What he found confirmed the anomalies that earlier researchers had noted, and added new ones. The foundation of the Osireion, he discovered, sits at a level approximately 9 meters below the base of the Seti I temple. 9 meters of accumulated debris, sand, and construction material separate the floor of the Osireion from the floor of the temple that supposedly shares the same period of construction. 9 meters of accumulation does not happen in a generation. It does not happen in a century. It takes considerably longer than the gap between the theoretical construction date of the Osireion and the construction of the Seti I temple above it, if both were built in roughly the same period, as the conventional dating implies. The depth is evidence of age. The greater the depth below surrounding ground level, the longer the structure has been there for the ground level to rise around it. The Osireion is very deep, deeper than it should be if Seti I built it. Frankfurt noted this. He noted the architectural anomalies. He noted the absence of decoration on the primary stonework. He noted the stylistic disconnect from New Kingdom construction. And then, as happens repeatedly in this series, the findings were published, absorbed into the academic record, and the investigation moved on without resolving the most important questions. Because resolving the most important questions would require acknowledging a date for the Osireion's core structure that the mainstream archaeological framework of ancient Egypt cannot accommodate. A date that predates Seti I by centuries, possibly by millennia, possibly by an interval long enough that the civilization that built the Osireion is not a civilization that our history books currently acknowledge. Let us be precise about what the evidence shows and what it does not. The evidence shows that the Osireion's core structure is built in a megalithic style found at no other New Kingdom site. It shows granite and quartzite blocks of a size and weight comparable to the heaviest stones used at Giza. It shows an absence of decoration on primary stonework that is almost unique in the entire corpus of ancient Egyptian sacred architecture. It shows a foundation depth inconsistent with the conventional dating. The evidence does not prove that the Osireion was built before the Old Kingdom. It does not prove that it was built by the same civilization that built the Sphinx. It does not prove a date of 10,000 BC or 12,000 BC or any specific date earlier than the New Kingdom. What the evidence shows is that the conventional dating, Seti I, circa 1280 BC, is insufficient to explain the physical characteristics of the structure. Something is wrong with the date. Either the date is wrong, or our understanding of what Egyptian builders were doing in the New Kingdom period is wrong, or both. And since the same architectural style, massive, undecorated, megalithic, granite, appears at Giza at sites that other evidence suggests predate the Old Kingdom, the simplest explanation is the one that the evidence points toward most directly. The Osireion was built before the period to which it has been conventionally assigned, significantly before, by a civilization that built in granite, without decoration, to a scale and a precision that the civilizations that came after them could not replicate and could not fully explain. A civilization that built at Giza and at Saqqara and at Abydos, that encoded in stone the oldest religious image in Egyptian cosmology, the primordial mound, the island in the waters of chaos, at a site sacred to the god of resurrection. That placed its most important structures underground, below the surface, in the dark, in water, in the realm of Osiris, as if it understood that what it was preserving was meant to outlast not just its own civilization, but the civilization they would follow, and the civilization after that, and however many generations would pass before someone arrived who could understand what they were looking at. We have reached, in this series, the 11th location. 11 locked doors, sealed chambers, forbidden excavations, unanswered questions. 11 places where the evidence points in a direction that the official history of our civilization has been for over a century declining to follow. The Osireion is in some ways the most honest of all of them, because even the mainstream archaeological literature acknowledges that it is anomalous, that it doesn't fit, that the conventional explanation is inadequate. It is the place where the official story most clearly runs out of answers. And it is the place dedicated to Osiris, built to embody the moment of creation, designed to be descended into, to be surrounded by water, to place the visitor at the center of the oldest mystery in Egyptian religion, that perhaps best captures what this series has been circling around from its very beginning. Something existed before us, something built in stone and aligned to stars, and encoded in the oldest religious images of the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. Something that understood that the knowledge it was preserving would need to survive catastrophe, would need to survive the kind of civilizational collapse that turns millennia of accumulated understanding into myth, and myth into legend, and legend into the kind of story that people tell around fires when they have forgotten why the story matters. The Osireion sits in its pit at Abydos, surrounded by water, its central platform rising from the flood, like the primordial mound it was built to represent. The water is still there. The granite is still there. The mystery of who built it, and when, and why they built it to look like the moment before creation, is still there, waiting for the flood to recede, waiting for the mound to emerge, waiting for the moment of resurrection that the God whose name it carries has been promising, in stone and water and darkness, for longer than our history remembers. There is one more detail about the Osireion that this series cannot leave unmentioned. On the ceiling of one of the chambers added to the Osireion complex during the later New Kingdom period, a chamber whose walls were decorated with astronomical texts and religious imagery by the priests who maintained the site, there is a carving. It is called the Abydos helicopter. That is not its official name. Its official classification is a section of relief carving in the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, in which a series of cartouches, oval frames containing hieroglyphic text, were modified over time as different pharaohs added and altered inscriptions, leaving behind a palimpsest of overlapping text that, in certain lighting conditions and from certain angles, appears to show images of modern vehicles: a helicopter, a submarine, an aircraft, a tank. The images are not hallucinations. They are visible. They have been photographed from multiple angles by multiple independent observers. They appear clearly in the carved stone. The mainstream explanation is pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar shapes in random or ambiguous patterns. The overlapping cartouches, modified by multiple hands over multiple centuries, created accidental combinations of form that the modern eye, trained to recognize modern machines, interprets as modern machines. This explanation is plausible, but it sits in a building directly adjacent to a structure, the Osireion, that was built in an architectural style inconsistent with its supposed date, using construction techniques inconsistent with its supposed makers, to a scale and precision that the civilization that supposedly built it had no known means to achieve. One anomaly in one location can be dismissed. Two anomalies in the same location require more explanation. The Abydos helicopter is probably pareidolia, but it is pareidolia found in a temple built next to a structure that mainstream archaeology cannot date, cannot fully explain, and cannot connect convincingly to any known period of Egyptian construction. At some point, the accumulation of things that cannot be explained in a single location stops being coincidence and starts being a pattern, the same pattern that runs through every location in this series. Something is here that should not be here by the standards of the history we have been taught. Something was built that the civilization we attribute it to could not have built. Something was encoded in stone that the civilization we attribute it to did not understand well enough to explain. And in the pit behind the Temple of Seti I, at Abydos, surrounded by water, its undecorated granite walls rising from the flood that never fully recedes, the Osireion sits, as it has sat for longer than we know, as it will sit for longer than we can imagine. The primordial mound, waiting for the waters to recede, waiting for the moment of creation to begin again, waiting for whoever is ready to descend into the darkness and understand, finally, what they are looking at. Across 11 videos in this series, we have visited locked chapels and sealed tunnels and hidden chambers and forbidden excavations and impossible stone boxes and underground structures that predate the history we think we know. We have found, at every location, the same pattern. Evidence that points in a direction the official narrative does not follow. Institutions that control access and decline to investigate. Questions that remain unanswered, not because the technology to answer them is lacking, but because answering them would require changing the story of where we came from, the story of how long human civilization has existed, the story of what was here before the civilizations we acknowledge, before Egypt, before Sumer, before the cultures that our textbooks begin with. The Osireion may be the clearest single expression of that larger mystery, because it sits in a pit, below the level of the world above it, surrounded by water, dedicated to the God of resurrection and the hidden and the waiting, as if it was built specifically to survive, specifically to endure through whatever catastrophe ended the civilization that built it, specifically to be found by whoever came after, however many thousands of years later, and to present them with a question they could not dismiss. We built this. We built it before your history began. We built it to last longer than your civilization will last. We built it so you would find it and measure it and be unable to explain it and be forced, eventually, if you are honest enough, to ask the question you have been avoiding. What came before? The Osireion does not answer that question. It is the question. In granite, in water, in the dark below the desert of Abydos, waiting for an answer that our civilization has not yet been willing to give.